Summer 1942. Japan's empire stretches across the Pacific like a wound that won't stop spreading. In just 6 months, they have seized more territory than any nation in modern history. Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. The Philippines, fallen, Singapore, surrendered in the greatest British military defeat of all time. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Burma, gone. The United States Navy has been humiliated. The Allied forces in the Pacific are scattered, undersupplied, and demoralized. Back home, Americans are asking a question no one wants to answer out loud. Can we actually win this war? Military planners in Washington are looking at maps and seeing the same terrifying picture. Japan controls the ocean, and Japan isn't stopping. Meanwhile, on a remote jungle island that doesn't appear on most maps, a small team of Japanese construction workers is quietly, methodically building something. An airfield. It doesn't sound like much, a strip of flattened earth in the middle of nowhere. But in 1942, airfields are everything. Whoever controls the air controls the sea, and whoever controls the sea controls the Pacific. If that airfield becomes operational, Japanese bombers can reach Australia. Allied supply lines get severed. Reinforcements can't get through. The entire balance of the war shifts, and this time, maybe permanently. Washington understands what this means, and Washington faces a decision with no good options. Wait, build up forces, train properly, prepare a real invasion and lose the Pacific in the meantime, or attack now, immediately, with whatever is available. Half-trained troops, insufficient air cover, a navy still recovering from its losses. They chose to attack anyway. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 United States Marines loaded onto transport ships and sailed toward a jungle island most of them had never heard of. No one told them how long they'd be there. No one told them what the jungle would do to them. And no one, not even the generals, fully understood what was waiting for them on Guadalcanal. To understand why Guadalcanal mattered so much, you have to understand how Japan thought about the war. Japan's strategy was never about conquering the United States. That was impossible, and Japanese commanders knew it. America was too large, too industrial, too distant. You couldn't invade a continent of 130 million people from across the largest ocean on Earth. The real plan was simpler, and in many ways, more frightening. Build an empire so vast, so deeply defended, that attacking it would cost more blood and treasure than any democratic government could justify to its people. Force the United States into a negotiated peace. Keep everything Japan had taken, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice of Southeast Asia, the iron and coal of Manchuria. Make the price of fighting so high that America would choose to stop. Create a wall across the Pacific that no one could break through. By the summer of 1942, that wall was almost complete. Japanese had established what they called the Outer Defense Perimeter, a vast chain of island bases, airfields, and naval strongpoints stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north, across the central Pacific, all the way down to the Solomon Islands in the south. It was one of the most ambitious defensive strategies in military history, and Guadalcanal sat at the very southern tip of that chain. The island itself had almost nothing to offer. No oil, no minerals worth mining, no significant population, just hundreds of square miles of dense jungle, jagged mountain ridges, rivers full of crocodiles, and a climate so brutal that tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, could hollow out a fighting force faster than enemy fire. In peacetime, Guadalcanal was the kind of place that appeared on maps only because cartographers felt obligated to label everything. But it had one thing that made it strategically priceless in 1942: flat ground near the coast. Flat ground where you could build an airfield. Japanese engineers had begun construction in the spring of 1942, moving methodically through the jungle, clearing trees, laying gravel, building the infrastructure that would transform this forgotten island into a key node in Japan's Pacific Empire. By early July, the airfield was only weeks away from completion, and American reconnaissance pilots had spotted it. In Washington and at Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor, the reaction was immediate. Alarm bells went off at the highest levels of Allied command. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations and one of the most aggressive, some would say ruthless commanders in American military history, looked at that airfield and saw a loaded gun pointed at everything the Allies were struggling to protect. From a completed airfield on Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could strike the vital supply routes running between the United States and Australia. They could provide air cover for further advances south toward New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. They could threaten the entire network of Allied bases that kept Australia connected to the outside world. And Australia, in 1942, was not just another country on the map. Australia was the last major Allied stronghold in the entire Pacific theater. It was the base from which any future offensive against Japan would have to be launched. It was home to hundreds of thousands of Allied troops and the industrial capacity to support them. Lose Australia, or even cut it off, and the entire Allied position in the Pacific doesn't just weaken, it collapses. King pushed hard for an immediate offensive operation. His army counterparts pushed back. The Marines weren't fully trained. The Navy was still rebuilding after Pearl Harbor. Logistics were nowhere near ready. Intelligence on Japanese positions was almost non-existent. King didn't care. The airfield couldn't wait. General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, received his orders in late June 1942. He and his men had been expecting several more months of training and preparation in New Zealand before seeing any combat. Instead, Vandegrift was told he had 5 weeks to plan and execute a full amphibious assault on a jungle island his own staff had to search for on a map. 5 weeks. To put that in perspective, major amphibious operations in World War II typically required 6 to 12 months of detailed planning, specialized landing craft, reversals, coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and ground forces, detailed maps, intelligence on enemy strength and positions. Vandegrift had almost none of this. His maps were incomplete, his intelligence was unreliable, many of his Marines had never fired a weapon in combat, and the Navy made it quietly clear that it could not guarantee how long it would be able to stay in the waters around Guadalcanal once the operation began. Vandegrift later wrote that receiving those orders was one of the darkest moments of his career. He knew what he was being asked to do. He knew what could go wrong, but he also knew there was no alternative. The airfield had to be taken before it was finished, before Japanese aircraft started flying from its runway, before the Southern Pacific slipped out of Allied reach entirely. Everything else, the planning, the preparation, the support, would have to be improvised along the way. On August 7, 1942, the ships left port. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. August 7, 1942. Before dawn, the ships moved into position off the coast of Guadalcanal. 11,000 Marines stood at the rails, looking at a dark wall of jungle rising from the water. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't a lot to say. At 6:14 in the morning, the naval guns opened fire. The bombardment was deafening. For nearly 2 hours, American warships poured shells into the jungle, into the beaches, into anything that might be hiding Japanese defenders. Carrier aircraft swept overhead, bombing and strafing the shoreline. And then the landing craft went in. What happened next surprised everyone. The beach was empty. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal numbered only about 2,000 men, and most of them were construction workers, not combat troops. Faced with the overwhelming force of an American naval bombardment, they did what any rational person would do. They ran. They disappeared into the jungle, abandoning their equipment, their food supplies, their half-finished airfield, and in some cases, their boots. By the end of the first day, the Marines had secured the beach and begun pushing inland. Within 2 days, they had captured the airfield. Vandegrift stood on the runway his men had just taken and allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. It had been almost too easy. He should have known that was a warning sign. because while the Marines were celebrating on the beach, a Japanese naval force was already moving south at full speed. And in the early hours of August 9th, everything changed. The Battle of Savo Island lasted 32 minutes. In those 32 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy sank 4 Allied cruisers and killed over 1,000 sailors. It was one of the worst naval defeats in American history. A masterclass in night fighting by a Japanese fleet that had trained for exactly this kind of battle. The American naval commander, caught completely off guard, made a decision that would define the next 6 months on Guadalcanal. He ordered the fleet to withdraw. The transport ships, still loaded with half of the Marines' supplies, ammunition, heavy equipment, and food, turned around and sailed away. Vandegrift watched them go. His 11,000 Marines were now alone on an island in the middle of the Pacific. They had supplies for roughly 37 days. They had no naval support. They had no guarantee of air cover. And they had thousands of Japanese soldiers somewhere in the jungle who were already regrouping and waiting for reinforcements. The easy part was over. The Marines immediately got to work finishing what the Japanese had started, completing the airfield. They worked around the clock, using captured Japanese equipment, filling in the remaining gaps in the runway by hand when they had to. On August 20th, 13 days after the landing, the first American aircraft touched down on what was now called Henderson Field, named after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. Henderson Field would become the most fought-over piece of ground in the Pacific War, because both sides understood the same thing perfectly clearly. Whoever held that airfield controlled the waters around Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled those waters controlled the island, and whoever controlled the island held the key to the entire southern Pacific. The Japanese weren't going to let it go without a fight. Their response came quickly, and it came from a direction the Marines hadn't fully anticipated, from the sea and from above. Every night, Japanese destroyers and cruisers made high-speed runs down a channel that American sailors would soon name the Slot, the strait between the Solomon Islands that led straight to Guadalcanal. They moved at night beyond the reach of American air power, delivering troops, supplies, and artillery to the island. The Marines called these nightly runs the Tokyo Express, and every night, without fail, the Tokyo Express delivered more Japanese soldiers to the jungle surrounding Henderson Field. At the same time, Japanese aircraft from bases further north began bombing the airfield on a daily basis. The Marines learned to distinguish the sound of different Japanese aircraft engines. They learned which attacks were likely to be serious and which were harassment raids. They dug foxholes next to the runway so pilots could sprint from their cockpits and take cover the moment the alert sounded. Sleep became a luxury. Hot food became a memory. The jungle, the heat, the rain, and the insects were relentless. And the Japanese ground assault was coming. On the night of August 21st, Colonel Kiona Ichiki led 900 of Japan's finest soldiers, veterans of the war in China, men who had never been defeated, in a frontal assault on the marine perimeter along the Ilu River. Ichiki had been told the Americans were weak, demoralized, and poorly trained. He was wrong. The Marines had dug in carefully, covered their flanks, and zeroed their weapons on the only ground the Japanese could cross. When Ichiki's men crossed the sandbar at the river mouth in the darkness, they ran into a wall of machine gun fire, mortars, and rifles. The battle lasted until dawn. When it was over, nearly 800 of Ichiki's 900 men were dead. Ichiki himself burned his regimental colors and took his own life rather than face the dishonor of defeat. It was the first major Japanese ground assault on Henderson Field. It would not be the last. And with each passing week, the Japanese were sending more men, more guns, and more ships. They were learning from their mistakes. They were getting stronger. The Marines, meanwhile, were getting thinner, sicker, and more exhausted. But they were still there. And Henderson Field was still flying American aircraft. September 1942. The Marines on Guadalcanal had been fighting for a month. They were supposed to be relieved weeks ago. Nobody was coming. Washington was in crisis. The Navy had suffered catastrophic losses at Savo Island and was deeply reluctant to risk more warships in the waters around Guadalcanal. Supplies were getting through only in trickles. Ammunition was running low. Food was running lower. The men were surviving on 2 meals a day, then 1 meal a day. Captured Japanese rice became a staple. Marines lost 20, 30, sometimes 40 pounds over the course of the campaign. Uniforms rotted off their bodies in the tropical heat. But the jungle wasn't just taking their weight. It was taking their health. Malaria swept through the Marine positions like a second enemy. At the peak of the campaign, more men were being evacuated for disease than for combat wounds. A Marine could be perfectly healthy on Monday and delirious with fever by Wednesday. Some men fought through multiple bouts of malaria because there simply weren't enough healthy men to replace them. Dysentery, dengue fever, fungal infections, jungle rot. The island attacked the human body from every direction simultaneously. And through all of it, every single night, the Japanese kept coming. The Tokyo Express ran like clockwork. Night after night, Japanese destroyers raced down the slot, delivered troops and supplies, and were gone before dawn when American aircraft could find them. By September, Japanese ground forces on the island had grown to match and then exceed the number of Marines. Japanese commanders were under enormous pressure from Tokyo to retake Henderson Field quickly. Emperor Hirohito himself was following the battle closely. Guadalcanal had become a matter of national prestige, a test of whether Japan's military machine could reverse a setback or whether the tide was beginning to turn. General Hiroyoshi Hyakutake was given command of the operation to retake the island. He sent some of Japan's finest units, soldiers who had conquered Singapore, soldiers who had never known defeat. In mid-September, they attacked. The assault came from the south, through terrain so brutal that the Japanese commanders assumed no serious defensive line could possibly exist there. They were going to come out of the jungle directly behind the Marine perimeter, overrun Henderson Field, and be done with it. What they found instead was a thin ridge held by a battalion of Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. The ridge had no official name at the time. After the night of September 13th, it would be known forever as Bloody Ridge. For 2 nights, wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged up that ridge in the darkness, screaming, firing, throwing grenades, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers and ferocity. Edson's Marines bent. They were pushed back. The perimeter shrank to almost nothing. At one point, the Japanese were within a few hundred meters of the runway. Henderson Field almost fell that night. Edson walked the line in the darkness, moving from position to position, telling his men quietly and firmly that this ridge was the only thing standing between the airfield and the ocean, that there was nowhere to fall back to, that this was where it ended, one way or the other. The Marines held. When dawn came, the ridge was still in American hands. The Japanese had lost over 800 men. Edson would receive the Medal of Honor. The Marines who survived that night would never quite be the same. But the battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. October brought a new level of terror. The Japanese had managed to land heavy artillery on the island, 150mm guns, big enough to destroy aircraft on the ground and make life on Henderson Field genuinely unbearable. Combined with the nightly naval bombardments, the airfield was under almost constant attack. On the night of October 13th, the Japanese sent 2 battleships, Congo and Haruna, to bombard Henderson Field directly. For 90 minutes, 14-inch shells rained down on the airfield and surrounding positions. Nearly 100 aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. Fuel supplies burned, ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions that lit up the entire jungle. The Marines in their foxholes could do nothing but press themselves into the earth and wait for it to stop. 41 men were killed that night,
Many more were wounded. Those who survived described it as the single most terrifying experience of their lives, and these were men who had already survived months of combat. By morning, Henderson Field was barely operational, and the situation was about to get worse. Because in October, Japan launched its largest and most carefully prepared ground offensive of the entire campaign. Approximately 20,000 Japanese soldiers, the largest force yet committed to the island, were positioned to attack the marine perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The plan was comprehensive, the forces were experienced, the timing was coordinated with a major naval offensive to cut off American reinforcements and resupply. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the mood was grim. Senior commanders privately acknowledged that Guadalcanal might fall. Plans were quietly being discussed for what an American withdrawal would mean strategically. Admiral William Bull Halsey had just taken command of the South Pacific Theater. He was blunt, aggressive, and completely unwilling to accept defeat. When he reviewed the situation on Guadalcanal for the first time, he reportedly said there were only three options: fight, or fight, or fight. The Japanese ground offensive began on October 23rd. Once again, the attack came through the jungle south of Henderson Field. Once again, the Marines were waiting. The assault lasted 3 days and nights. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly into prepared defensive positions against machine guns and artillery that had been carefully zeroed onto every approach. The bravery of the attacking troops was extraordinary and, in the end, futile. When the offensive collapsed on October 26th, Japan had lost over 2,000 soldiers in front of the Marine lines. American losses were in the dozens. The airfield had held. But nobody on Guadalcanal was celebrating, because the men holding that airfield by now were shadows of themselves, gaunt, hollow-eyed, shaking with malaria, running on almost no sleep, wearing uniforms that had long since fallen apart. They had beaten back every attack Japan had thrown at them. But everyone, from the newest private to Vandegrift himself, was asking the same quiet, exhausted question. How much longer could they keep doing this?
November 1942. 6 months had passed since the Marines first landed on Guadalcanal. 6 months of jungle, disease, starvation, and relentless combat. 6 months of holding on by sheer willpower against an enemy that refused to stop attacking. And now, in November, both sides threw everything they had left into one final, desperate struggle for the island. Because both sides understood the same brutal truth. Whoever won the next round probably won Guadalcanal, and whoever won Guadalcanal probably won the Pacific. Japan's answer was its most ambitious naval operation since Midway. A massive convoy of 11 transport ships carrying over 10,000 fresh troops and enough supplies to sustain a major offensive, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. If that convoy got through, if those troops landed, the exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal would finally be overwhelmed. The American Navy moved to stop it. What followed was the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, 3 days of fighting between November 12th and November 15th that became one of the largest and most chaotic naval engagements in history. Ships fought at such close range that guns couldn't depress low enough to hit their targets. Destroyers rammed each other in the darkness. Sailors who survived one sinking found themselves swimming toward another battle. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led his force into the fight knowing he was outgunned. He was killed on the bridge of his flagship early in the battle. So was Rear Admiral Norman Scott. 2 American admirals dead in a single night. The losses on both sides were staggering, but when the smoke cleared and the wreckage stopped burning, the arithmetic told a clear story. The Japanese convoy had been devastated. 7 of the 11 transport ships were sunk or destroyed before they could fully unload. The troops that did make it ashore arrived without heavy weapons, without ammunition, without food. They were combat ineffective almost immediately. The battleship USS Washington had caught the Japanese battleship Kirishima in the darkness and destroyed her with radar-guided gunfire, one of the most decisive single-ship actions of the entire Pacific War. Japan had thrown its best hand. It hadn't been enough. In Tokyo, the conversations that followed were quiet and deeply uncomfortable. Japan's senior naval commanders had to face a reality they had been avoiding for months. Guadalcanal could not be retaken. Every major ground offensive had failed. Every attempt to reinforce the island had cost more than it gained. The Americans were getting stronger. More aircraft, more ships, more men were arriving in the South Pacific every month. Japan, by contrast, was beginning to feel the strain of fighting across an empire that stretched thousands of miles in every direction. The decision was made at the highest levels of Japanese command and made in secrecy. Guadalcanal would be abandoned. But the evacuation couldn't look like a retreat. It couldn't look like defeat. It had to be disguised, carefully planned, executed under the noses of an American military that would do everything in its power to prevent it. The operation was given the code name KE. Through January 1943, Japanese forces on the island were quietly reorganized. The sickest and most severely wounded were moved to the coast first. Supply runs by the Tokyo Express continued, so the Americans would assume the Japanese were still reinforcing rather than evacuating. Decoy attacks were launched to draw American attention away from the beaches. And the men remaining on the island were told almost nothing. For the Japanese soldiers still in the jungle, men who had been fighting and starving for months, men who had watched their units destroyed one attack at a time, these final weeks were perhaps the worst of all. They didn't know if rescue was coming. They didn't know if they had been forgotten. Many were too sick to walk without help. They ate roots, they drank from streams, they carried their wounded through jungle that seemed specifically designed to break the human body. On the night of February 1st, 1943, Japanese destroyers made their final runs down the slot. Over 3 nights, they evacuated approximately 10,652 soldiers from Guadalcanal. It was, by any objective measure, a brilliantly executed operation. The Americans, incredibly, didn't fully realize what was happening until it was almost over. Patrols moving through areas that should have been defended found them empty. Positions that had been tenaciously for months were simply abandoned. On February 9, 1943, General Patch sent a message to Admiral Halsey: total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. The island was secure. The campaign that had begun with 11,000 Marines landing on an empty beach 6 months earlier was finally officially over. But for many of the men involved, the news didn't feel the way they had imagined it would. There was no celebration in the jungle that day. No cheering, no speeches, no sense of triumphant relief. The men who received the news were too exhausted, too sick, too hollowed out by 6 months of survival to feel much of anything. One Marine asked later how he felt when he heard the island was secured, thought about it for a moment. Then he said he mostly just felt tired.
February 9th, 1943. Guadalcanal was over. But what had actually happened there? What had 6 months of jungle fighting, naval battles, and starvation actually decided? On the surface, the numbers told one story. The United States had lost approximately 7,100 men, around 1,600 killed in ground combat, the rest lost at sea or to disease. 29 ships had been sunk in the waters around the island. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed. The campaign had cost an enormous amount of blood, steel, and treasure. Japan's losses were catastrophic. Approximately 31,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen had died in the Guadalcanal campaign. Roughly 38 ships had been sunk. But the numbers that mattered most weren't the ships or the soldiers, they were the pilots. Japan had begun the Pacific War with the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had trained for years, sometimes decades. Men who had perfected the art of carrier aviation, torpedo attacks, precision bombing. Men who were genuinely irreplaceable in the short term. At Guadalcanal, Japan lost hundreds of these men. Not just any pilots, the veterans, the instructors, the men who were supposed to train the next generation.
They flew mission after mission over the Solomons, out of range of rescue if they went down, and they went down in numbers that Japanese naval aviation could never recover from. After Guadalcanal, Japan would never again have the same quality of air power it had possessed at Pearl Harbor and Midway. The aircraft would be replaced, the pilots never would be. But the losses went deeper than numbers. Guadalcanal broke something in the psychology of Japanese military planning that couldn't be repaired. Before Guadalcanal, Japan had never lost a significant ground engagement in the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers were considered by many, including themselves, to be virtually undefeatable in jungle combat. Their willingness to fight to the last man, to charge into machine gun fire, to endure conditions that would break most armies, this had been their greatest weapon. At Guadalcanal, it wasn't enough. The Marines had matched them in toughness, surpassed them in firepower, and beaten them in engagement after engagement. Every major Japanese ground offensive had been destroyed against prepared American positions. The mythology of Japanese invincibility in the jungle died on that island, and everyone on both sides knew it. For the United States, the lesson ran in the opposite direction. When the Marines landed on August 7, 1942, the American military had never successfully executed a major amphibious assault in World War II. Everything about the Guadalcanal operation, the planning, the logistics, the coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, had been improvised under fire. By the time the island was secured, the Americans had learned more about amphibious warfare in 6 months than most military planners had understood in decades. They had developed doctrine, tactics, and institutional knowledge that would be applied to every major Pacific operation that followed. Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Every one of those campaigns was built on lessons learned at Guadalcanal, and strategically the shift was permanent and unmistakable. Before Guadalcanal, Japan held the initiative in the Pacific. They chose when to attack, where to strike, which islands to take. The Allies were reacting, defending, trying to slow the advance. After Guadalcanal, the initiative never returned to Japan. From February 1943 onward, it was Japan that was reacting, Japan that was defending, Japan that was choosing which islands to hold and which to abandon. The long, grinding American advance up through the Pacific, island by island, airfield by airfield, had begun. Japan still had enormous strength. The war would last another 2.5 years. Hundreds of thousands more people would die before it was over. The battles ahead would be, in many cases, even more brutal than what had happened on Guadalcanal. But the direction of the war had been decided on that jungle island. Japan's strategy, the great defensive wall across the Pacific, the empire too costly to attack, the negotiated peace, had depended entirely on never losing the initiative, on always being the aggressor, on making the price of resistance too high to pay. Guadalcanal proved that the price could be paid, and once that was proven, once the Marines on that island had held Henderson Field through 6 months of everything Japan could throw at them, the rest followed logically, inevitably, one brutal step at a time. The men who held that airfield didn't win World War II by themselves, but they may have been the ones who made winning possible. They were never supposed to be there that long. They were never supposed to fight under those conditions with those supplies against that enemy. Nobody planned for 6 months of hell in the jungle. They just stayed anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. And because Henderson Field, that strip of flattened earth in the middle of the Pacific, that piece of ground that nobody had heard of before August 1942, had somehow become the most important place in the world. If you want to understand how World War II in the Pacific was won, you don't start with the atomic bomb. You don't start with the great naval battles of 1944. You don't start with MacArthur's return to the Philippines. You start here, on a jungle island that nobody wanted, in a campaign that almost nobody believed could succeed, fought by men who simply refused to stop. Japan's defeat at Guadalcanal set in motion a chain of events that would end their empire, but the road to Tokyo was still long, and the battles ahead would be even more costly. Next, we follow the Allied advance deeper into the Pacific, towards islands whose names would become synonymous with some of the most brutal fighting in human history. If you want to see that story, subscribe now. Every week we go deeper into the battles, decisions, and sacrifices that shaped the Second World War. The next video is already coming. Don't miss it.